There's a special kind of cold that hides behind the perfect holiday. My name is Emily Jackson. I came home for Thanksgiving expecting warm pies and fake smiles, but I found a conspiracy. My family home, smelling of cinnamon and wood smoke, had become a viper's nest. My younger brother, the charming favorite, was planning to sell my future, our family legacy, to cover his sins. He and my father thought I was just the quiet, dutiful daughter. They didn't know they were whispering their betrayal just loud enough for me to hear. They were about to learn what happens when the invisible one finally decides to fight back. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The air in my small Midwestern hometown always smelled the same in November, a sharp, sweet mix of wood smoke and decaying leaves. It was the smell of nostalgia, the scent of coming home. As I parked my sensible sedan behind my father's oversized truck, I took a deep breath, trying to let that familiar comfort settle my nerves. It was Thanksgiving, and I was home. For me, Emily Jackson, home, was a complicated word. I was in my late 20s, building a life I was proud of in the city, working in social work, fighting for community programs, and finally getting close to the financial independence I craved. My moral compass was my true north, and it pointed firmly toward helping others, a value that ironically felt increasingly alien in the house I grew up in. The Jackson family home was a picture-perfect postcard of holiday warmth. Wreaths on the doors, the flicker of the fireplace visible through the living room window, and already the unmistakable, glorious smell of a roasting turkey and my mother's legendary pumpkin pies. My mother Linda met me at the door, wrapping me in an apron-clad hug that smelled of flour and cinnamon. "Emily, baby, you made it! Oh, it's so good to have you!" Her smile was genuine, but her eyes as always held a familiar flicker of anxiety, a silent plea for the day to go smoothly. My mother was a loving, wonderful woman who operated as the family's designated conflict avoider, smoothing over the cracks she refused to acknowledge were there. "It's good to be home, Mom," I said, and I meant it, mostly. My father Gerald looked up from his armchair, the glow of the football game reflecting in his glasses. "Emily." He gave a curt nod, the greeting of a man who measured affection in kilowatts provided and roofs kept over heads. He was the provider, a traditionalist to his core, and he viewed my career in social work as a kind of well-meaning, financially irresponsible hobby. And then there was Ryan. My younger brother, the charming, reckless, manipulative prodigal son, breezed in 20 minutes later, all apologies and dazzling smiles. "Sorry I'm late. Had to help Mrs. Henderson down the street with a flat tire. You know, she just can't manage that stuff on her own." He kissed our mother's cheek, clapped our father on the back, who grunted in approval, and then pulled me into a hug that felt more like a containment field. "Hey, sis. Still trying to save the world." Ryan had always been like this, a shadow that twisted my light. He had a sixth sense for my successes and an arsenal of subtle ways to undermine them. He was the favored one, the one whose potential was always just about to be realized, while my actual achievements were treated as quiet peculiarities. The tension started, as it always did, in small, almost invisible ways. Over pre-dinner snacks, my aunt asked about my job. I started to explain a new community outreach program I'd secured grant funding for, a project I'd poured months of my life into. I was proud of it. Before I could finish the sentence, Ryan laughed, grabbing another handful of mixed nuts. "That's M for you, always with the handouts. Hey, Dad, speaking of helping you, should have seen the turnout for that Feed the Vets drive I put together." My father nodded his chest, puffing with pride. "That's my boy, making a real difference." I bit my tongue. Ryan's drive had been a single Facebook post, which I had then shared to my own network to ensure anyone actually showed up. Ryan caught my eye and gave me a tiny, knowing smirk. He took credit. Again. Later I mentioned I was days away from signing a lease on my own apartment, a huge step. Ryan just snorted. "Renting still? I'm closing on a duplex over on Maple. Flipping it. You gotta think bigger, Em." My father grunted. "He's right. Equity. That's what matters." My mother just smiled vaguely and said, More cider, anyone? I retreated to the kitchen, the supposed heart of the home, to help my mother. I felt the familiar pull, the agonizing tear between my loyalty to this family, this idea of home, and the desperate need for self-preservation. I looked at my hands, hands that wrote grant proposals, and held the hands of people in crisis, and I felt invisible. My dreams of independence weren't just about money. They were about breathing, about existing in a space where I wasn't constantly being minimized, my contributions erased. The feast was laid out, a stunning display of Midwestern bounty. We sat, we passed, we ate. The conversation was light, the familiar script of a family determined to have a perfect holiday. I was just starting to relax, lulled by the tryptophan and the decades of programming, when I got up to refill the water pitcher. The swinging door to the kitchen didn't latch. It whispered open a crack, and in that silence, as the dining room chatter faded, I heard voices from the adjacent study. My father's low rumble and Ryan's smooth, persuasive tone. They must have stepped away from the table. "The buyer is solid, Dad," Ryan said, his voice stripped of its usual charm, now cold and transactional. "They don't care about all that community hub nonsense Emily was pushing. They just want the location. It's a done deal." My blood ran cold. Community hub. That was my phrase, my plan. I'd spent 2 unpaid summers modernizing the family bakery, a place I adored, a place I thought was our legacy. I'd built its website, started a children's reading hour, and mapped out a 5-year plan for growth. "Good," my father replied. "This will cover your debts and we can finally be done with the place. We'll tell your sister after Christmas. She's too sentimental. She wouldn't understand the business of it." I stood frozen, the heavy glass pitcher cold in my hands. The smell of pumpkin pie suddenly turned sour in my throat. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a subtle dig. This was a calculated betrayal, a dagger wrapped in a Thanksgiving bow. The warmth of the holiday evaporated, leaving only a chilling, razor-sharp clarity. The woman who walked into this house seeking comfort was gone. In her place, a new resolve began to ignite, hot and bright in the sudden winter of my shock. The air never warmed up after Thanksgiving. A biting, premature winter settled over the town, and with it, a coldness settled deep in my chest. Days bled into the first week of December. I'd extended my visit, telling my boss I was working remotely, an excuse that sounded plausible, but was in reality a cover for an internal civil war. The shock of that overheard conversation, selling the bakery I loved, using my sentimental attachment as the excuse to hide it from me, all to cover Ryan's unnamed debts, had hardened into a singular grinding anger. I felt the grief, yes, the sorrow for the years of subtle favoritism and emotional manipulation I'd finally allowed myself to see clearly. But right now, anger was a sharper, more useful tool. My father and Ryan were often out now citing business errands. My mother, bless her heart, was determined to inject some festive cheer into the growing domestic chill. It was a Saturday afternoon, and the first serious snow of the season was falling in thick, quiet curtains outside. We were in my father's spacious oak-paneled office, a room usually considered sacrosanct, digging through boxes of old ornaments for the Christmas tree. My mother was humming a carol, blissfully unaware of the seismic shift that had occurred beneath the veneer of holiday decorating. She asked me to check the old credenza for the antique angel topper. As I reached inside, my fingers brushed against a manila folder, tucked deep behind a stack of tax returns. It was labeled simply RJ Finances. My heart hammered against my ribs. Ryan Jackson. I knew instantly that this wasn't an ornament. My internal monologue was a scream of conflict. "Stop. This is an invasion of privacy. This is betrayal." But a louder, colder voice insisted, "They betrayed you first. You have a right to know the truth." I pulled the folder out, sliding it under a pile of dusty garland, and waited until my mother moved back toward the living room with a box of tinsel. Alone, the office suddenly felt vast and silent, save for the muffled scrape of the snowplow outside. I opened the folder. The documents were a horrifying confirmation. Financial records, angry-sounding emails from a collection agency, and a printed draft of a preliminary contract for the sale of Jackson's Family Bakery, listing Ryan as the sole family contact in the negotiation process. The amount was staggering. It wasn't just debt. It was massive gambling debt. He wasn't just reckless. He was spiraling and pulling my family's legacy down with him. I felt a wave of nausea. All those years, all those subtle sabotages, all the charm, it was all a shell for this panicked, destructive selfishness. I confronted Ryan that night. He was in the kitchen, scrolling on his phone, sipping eggnog. I walked in, slammed the folder down on the butcher block, and pointed at the loan shark's email. "What is this, Ryan?" My voice was low, shaking, trying not to alert my parents upstairs. He didn't even flinch at the sound of the paper. He looked up, his eyes wide and innocent. "And what's gotten into you snooping in Dad's stuff that's low?" He went straight for the gaslighting, the denial of wrongdoing, and it was a masterpiece of manipulation. He claimed the contract was an old draft, that the debts were just short-term business loans that were misrepresented. He spun a wild story about how the bakery needed re-strategizing and that selling it was the only way to save the family fortune, making me sound like a hysterical child for caring about a few old ovens. His utter lack of remorse, the quick, smooth lie, didn't just enrage me. It clarified everything. I wasn't dealing with a flawed brother. I was dealing with a professional liar whose self-interest was absolute. My path became clear. This could not be impulsive revenge. It had to be precise. I needed an ally, a sounding board, and someone who saw beneath the family's gold-plated surface. I drove through the falling snow to see Mrs. Thompson. She wasn't just a neighbor. She was my mother's oldest friend, and the closest thing I had to a wise grandmother figure. We sat in her sunroom, the air smelling of Earl Grey and old paperbacks. I laid out the whole story, the betrayal, the documents, the gambling. Mrs. Thompson listened without judgment, simply nodding, her eyes sharp. "Betrayal is a terrible fire, Emily," she said quietly. "But you can use that heat not to burn yourself, but to forge something strong. You need resilience, child, and cleverness." She didn't suggest revenge. She suggested agency, taking control of my own destiny and that of the bakery. She confirmed what I suspected. Ryan had been quietly asking around town about selling the property, often spinning conflicting stories. I began my quiet strategy. My first move was to tap into the community. I called longtime bakery patrons, the mayor's secretary, the owner of the hardware store next door, and a few retired teachers who relied on the bakery's senior discount day. I didn't reveal the whole truth, only that I had unsettling concerns about the bakery's sudden change of direction and that Ryan's recent actions seemed dishonest. I subtly exposed the minor discrepancies Ryan had created, the inflated figures he'd given a local contractor, the bounced check to the flour supplier I found in the folder. I wasn't slandering him. I was simply asking questions that pointed toward his unreliability. Slowly, whispers began. The air of trust around charming Ryan began to dissipate, replaced by suspicion. I was laying the groundwork, building my network, collecting the evidence not for a fight but for a checkmate. Every night I stayed up researching legal loopholes regarding family businesses, promissory notes, and community impact clauses. I was operating purely on adrenaline and a burning sense of justice. The feeling of taking back control, of acting decisively instead of reacting defensively, was intoxicating. I was no longer the invisible daughter. I was the strategist, the guardian of my own future. My independence wasn't just a dream anymore. It was the weapon I was sharpening. The tension was becoming almost unbearable, the silence in the house between us thick and brittle. My final piece of information came from an old employee I contacted, someone Ryan had recently fired without cause. He confirmed the signing date. Ryan had scheduled the final, irreversible step, the transfer of ownership, for the night before Christmas Eve. The perfect silent bomb timed to detonate right after he left town with the money. The cold resolve in my heart burned brighter now, focused entirely on that single date, Christmas Eve. The snow outside was no longer falling quietly. It was a howling cinematic frenzy. The blizzard had fully arrived, trapping us inside the house like characters in a slow-burn thriller. The air was thick, charged with the nervous anticipation of a holiday that felt anything but joyful. Ryan was jittery, constantly checking his phone. He believed he had won, that the final signing with the buyer, scheduled for 7 o'clock sharp that evening at a neutral location, would go off without a hitch. He was smiling too much too loudly, praising the holiday ham, convinced he was about to disappear into the snowy night with the money. But tonight he wasn't going anywhere. Tonight was the climax. I wore my quiet confidence like armor. My heart was pounding, a wild, frantic drumbeat beneath my sweater, but I moved with deliberate calm. My plan wasn't born of malice. It was born of justice and meticulously researched legal loopholes. I had spent weeks preparing, and the execution was simple, subtle, and ethically justified. I hadn't filed a lawsuit or called the police that would destroy the family and the bakery instantly. My goal was to stop Ryan's deceit and force accountability. At precisely 6:45 p.m., just as Ryan put on his coat, announcing vaguely that he had to run some last-minute errands, I stopped him in the living room. My father Gerald was adjusting the fire, and my mother Linda was setting out the cocoa cups. The perfect holiday scene ready for destruction. I held up a single laminated document. "Going somewhere, Ryan. You might want to cancel that meeting." My voice was steady, utterly devoid of emotion, which seemed to unnerve him more than any shouting. Ryan glared at the document, but didn't take it. "What is this? Stop being dramatic, Emily." He looked at Gerald for backup, his face already flushing with panic. "It's an injunction," I stated simply. "A temporary stop order on the sale of Jackson's family bakery. You signed a partnership agreement with me 2 years ago when I put my entire savings into the modernization fund. You forgot about the community impact clause we wrote in. The clause that mandates a majority vote from the 5 longest-standing patrons and the local planning committee, the same committee I've been serving on for 6 months, if the business is sold for purely liquidating purposes and not for the benefit of the community." Ryan's jaw dropped, his eyes darting wildly. "That clause is worthless. It's boilerplate." It was boilerplate until I got 5 sworn statements from the community leaders, people who have been served by the bakery for decades, all stating in clear legal language that the sudden sale by a single non-resident partner is directly against the community's best interest, I countered. I collected the signatures. Mrs. Thompson helped me file the papers. They arrived on the buyer's desk 10 minutes ago. Your deal is dead. I hadn't had to use the gambling debt, I used his own negligence and my community standing against him. The confrontation scene detonated instantly. Ryan lunged for me, then stopped himself, screaming, "You traitor! You think you're so smart, you just ruined us! You ruined us, Ryan!" I spat back, the fury finally breaking through the ice. "Not me. I saved the bakery from becoming your personal ATM. I found the financial records, the emails from the collection agencies, the proof that you were willing to sacrifice Dad's legacy and Mom's retirement to cover your gambling debts." I didn't care about keeping my voice down anymore. My mother gasped, dropping a porcelain mug. It shattered on the hardwood floor, the sound impossibly loud. Gerald turned from the fireplace, his face a mask of sick, slow-dawning horror. "Gambling. Debts," he whispered, looking from Ryan's now scarlet, panicked face to my resolute stance. The shouts escalated. Ryan unleashed a torrent of defensive lies and vicious personal attacks, calling me jealous, cold, and a failed idealist. I stood my ground, my voice rising above his, clear and powerful. "I demand accountability, Ryan. Not just for me, but for this community, for Mom, and for the life you stole from me when you decided your greed was more important than our family name." This wasn't just about the bakery. This was me articulating my boundaries, demanding the respect I'd been denied for 20 years. Gerald was completely torn. His face showed a sickening mix of blind parental favoritism, colliding violently with the undeniable proof of fairness. He looked at the documents, then at Ryan, then at me. He had always seen me as the problem, the sensitive, difficult one. Now the roles were reversed. I was the responsible one, the protector. The fierce snowstorm outside rattled the windows, a deafening drumbeat that perfectly mirrored the internal chaos gripping our small, broken family unit. It was the emotional peak, raw and agonizing. Ryan, seeing his father's doubt, went for the ultimate desperate low blow. He turned to our mother, falling to his knees in a truly sickening, manipulative performance. "Mom, please, don't let her do this. You know I'm the only one who takes care of you. She's doing this because she hates us. Tell Dad." My mother, Linda, was weeping, her hands covering her face. For a terrifying moment, I thought his emotional blackmail would work, but I intervened decisively, stepping in front of Ryan, shielding her. "No, Ryan, not this time. She is done being your shield. You are an adult, and you will face the consequences of your own choices. Mom, you don't owe him protection anymore. You owe yourself peace." I looked Gerald directly in the eye, my voice firm. "We need to talk about what really happened tonight." The silence that followed was heavy, the snow still raging outside. Ryan was defeated, his schemes fully unraveled, his face slack with shock. I had transformed completely. The vulnerable girl seeking her father's approval was gone, replaced by a woman in full power, ready to face the consequences, ready to rebuild. I had won the battle, but the war for our family's soul had just begun. The hours following the confrontation were the quietest, heaviest hours I had ever experienced in that house. The storm raged outside, burying the world in white, but the true devastation was internal. Ryan was forced to admit his wrongdoing. He was cornered, stripped of his charm and his lies, and he finally had to confess the full, ugly truth about the gambling debts and his plan to liquidate the bakery. He tried weakly to minimize the impact, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the witness, my shattered mother, was undeniable. His confession was not an apology, but a miserable, resentful acknowledgement of defeat. He was sent to his room with a final defeated gesture from my father. The real challenge began when I was alone with Gerald. He was silent for a long time, staring into the flickering embers of the fire, the same fire he'd been tending when I exposed the betrayal. It was the hardest conversation of my life, but I was determined to face it. I didn't yell or accuse. I spoke from a place of deep, wounded honesty. I helped him understand that the issue wasn't just Ryan's recklessness, it was his favoritism. "Dad," I started, my voice low and steady. "You always saw Ryan's chaos as potential, and you saw my structure as rigidity. You gave him every chance to fail upward, and you consistently undermined my efforts because they didn't fit your idea of success. That favoritism, that deep-seated belief that Ryan was worth saving at any cost, is what allowed this long-term harm to happen. Not just to the bakery, but to me." I watched him process this, the truth hitting him not as an attack, but as a mirror. He was stern, not heartless. He had been blind, wrapped up in his own traditionalist ideas of a provider and a manly successor. His face crumpled slowly, the mask of control finally cracking. He didn't offer a full, immediate reconciliation. That would be too easy, but he offered a start. I see it, Emily," he muttered, shaking his head. "I thought I was protecting him. I thought you were strong enough not to need my help. I was wrong. I apologize for misjudging your efforts and for letting this happen to the bakery. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to spark the long, slow process of deeper family introspection." My mother, Linda, was the first true light in the aftermath. The following morning, Christmas Day, everything felt fragile but clearer. She didn't press me for details about the legal maneuvering. Instead, she came into the kitchen where I was making coffee, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. She simply wrapped me in a tight, sustained hug. "You were so brave, Emily," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You stood up to him, to your father, to the whole history of this house. I didn't think you had it in you. I didn't know I had it in me to watch you do it." Her expression was one of pride and a newfound respect. Our bond was built not on avoiding conflict, but on shared courage. Word of the averted sale spread quickly, not through gossip, but through the tight-knit network I had cultivated. The community didn't just celebrate my victory, they celebrated the preservation of their beloved bakery. Customers came by that afternoon braving the snow, dropping off small gifts and cards for me, thanking me for saving Jackson's. The sense of community support was overwhelming. The bakery, now under my temporary management with Gerald's reluctant agreement, was undeniably in safe hands. Themes of resilience and fairness resonated through every call and every card. I was no longer just the social worker daughter, I was the local hero. As the day settled into quiet afternoon reflection, I finally allowed myself to feel the emotional cost of the betrayal and the revenge. It was a victory won through pain. I felt exhausted, hollowed out, but fundamentally stronger. My growth was absolute. I had learned that trust wasn't a guarantee of loyalty, and that my own instincts, the ones that told me Ryan was a viper, were valid and essential. I had valued my agency over easy peace. I was no longer afraid of confrontation, I was afraid of complicity. Later that evening, the doorbell rang. It wasn't a family member, but my friend Marcus. He had driven for hours through the storm to check on me, saying he'd heard the rumors swirling through town that I'd gone full legal eagle. He brought pizza and a bottle of cheap wine. We sat by the fire talking, laughing about the absurdity of the holiday melodrama. There was no romance, but his presence, a pure supportive friendship, and non-judgmental comfort reinforced my journey toward independence. It was a reminder that my support system existed outside the four walls of this broken house. I felt a tentative sense of optimism, a cautious hope for the future. The crisis was over. The lie was dead. As I was cleaning up the wrapping paper late that night, I noticed a piece of mail stuck to the floor near the tree. It was a simple beige Christmas card, heavier than the rest. It was unsigned. Inside, printed in neat block handwriting, were just 3 words: "This isn't over." My heart gave a sickening lurch. The card had no postmark, meaning it had been placed inside the house. Ryan was still here. His threat wasn't loud or dramatic. It was silent, insidious, and utterly terrifying. He may have been defeated, but he was not finished. The lingering suspense was a cold, sharp reminder: a betrayal that runs this deep rarely ends with a clean confession and a Christmas card. 3 days had passed since Christmas Day, and the chilling arrival of the unsigned card. The suspense it carried was a dull, constant ache, but I refused to let it paralyze me. I took the anonymous threat and filed it away mentally, treating it as motivation rather than fear. Ryan was still technically in the house, a distant, ostracized presence confined largely to the guest wing. My father, Gerald, hadn't quite figured out how to discipline a 30-year-old son, so he defaulted to silence and distance. Ryan was alive, physically safe, but socially and financially devastated. This felt like a necessary, if temporary, resolution, a vacuum of consequence that allowed me to focus on rebuilding. The true work of the holiday season began now, creating something whole from the wreckage. I decided to initiate a new, healthier family tradition. It wasn't about erasing the past, but about laying a stronger foundation for the future. On the day after Boxing Day, I invited my mother and a few loyal friends, Marcus, Mrs. Thompson, and the baker I'd promoted to head pastry chef, for a small, joyous Christmas gathering at the bakery itself. The bakery felt like a sanctuary. It was closed for the week, but the enormous ovens radiated warmth, and the air was thick with the scent of yeast and cinnamon, a world away from the cold tension of the family home. My mother arrived not just as a guest, but as a genuine participant. We spent the afternoon in symbolic gestures of renewal. We didn't just talk, we did. We baked together, my mother and I, flour dusting our hair as we perfected the sourdough starter, laughing easily for the first time in weeks. We decorated a small tree in the corner with garland and mismatched ornaments that represented the community: a plastic whisk, a tiny rolling pin. We even tried badly to sing carols as the oven timer dinged. The sounds were off-key and wonderful. It was a visual and emotional contrast to the suffocating performance of the previous weeks, a real, unforced sense of connection. This wasn't just a party. It was a physical manifestation of my hard-won resilience. I had fought for this place, and now it was nourishing me, not draining me. As I watched the small group around the worn wooden counter, my mother relaxed and smiling, Marcus effortlessly supportive, Mrs. Thompson watching me with a look of deep approval, I felt a profound sense of peace. Later, when the others had gone and the quiet hum of the cooling ovens filled the space, my mother and I sat sipping tea. I allowed myself to fully reflect on resilience, justice, and personal freedom. It was a difficult month, Mom, I admitted, swirling the tea in my mug. The hardest, she agreed softly. But you found your voice, Emily. You stood up for what was right, not just for you, but for all of us who were too afraid to speak up. I recognized that the betrayal had been a painful, clarifying force. It stripped away the illusion of the perfect family and exposed the truth that my happiness could not be tied to their approval or their dysfunction. My freedom wasn't granted, it was claimed. I had transformed the darkest period of my life into my greatest source of strength. Ryan's presence was minimized, but his absence was thematic. He was the ghost of Christmases past, a powerful lesson in choosing accountability over blind loyalty. I had lost the idea of having a functional brother, but I gained an honest relationship with myself, my community, and eventually my parents. I left the bakery pulling my coat tight as the first stars emerged over the snow-covered street. The air was frigid, clean, and silent. I drove back toward the house, but I knew I wouldn't be staying much longer. My apartment lease in the city was ready to sign, and this time I was moving out not in silent retreat, but in proud advance. In the final internal monologue that carried me to my door, I felt empowered, emotionally clarified, and grounded in my values. I hadn't sought revenge for bitterness. I sought justice for agency. The bittersweet nature of the victory, winning the battle but fracturing the family, was simply the cost of truth. I had chosen truth. I had chosen myself. I looked back at the house, at the brightly lit Christmas tree in the window, no longer feeling trapped but sovereign. The holiday was over, but my new life had just begun. My final thought, poetic, cinematic, and filled with catharsis, settled like the freshly fallen snow. The winter of broken trust had come, but in its fierce, cold light, I finally saw the truth. The best legacy I could ever preserve wasn't the bakery, but the unshakable, uncompromising strength of my own name. And so Emily Jackson closed the winter of broken trust, emerging not unscathed, but undeniably stronger. If you were rooting for Emily to reclaim her family's legacy, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dive narratives. What would you have done in her position? Let us know below. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.